What happens when love is met with a wall of rejection? For one man, the answer was a path of bloodshed that would shatter a family and a community forever. This is the chilling story of how a simple no ignited a firestorm of vengeance. Before we delve into this harrowing tale, make sure you hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell so you don't miss out on our gripping stories. Now let's begin. The first time Ethan saw Clara, it was as if the world had momentarily paused, the cacophony of the bustling city street fading into a muted hum. She was standing in front of a small art gallery, her head tilted slightly as she studied a painting in the window, a cascade of auburn hair framing a face that seemed to belong to a different, more graceful era. He was on his way to a meeting, a man consumed by the relentless pace of his corporate life, but in that instant all the deadlines and presentations and bottom lines became utterly insignificant. He changed his course, a magnetic pull he couldn't explain drawing him towards her. Their conversation started simply, a shared appreciation for the artist's use of color, but it quickly blossomed into something more profound. They talked for what felt like minutes but was, in reality, over an hour, standing on that busy sidewalk, oblivious to the world rushing by. Ethan was captivated by her passion for art, the way her eyes lit up as she spoke of brushstrokes and canvases. Clara, in turn, was intrigued by his sharp mind and the unexpected gentleness in his voice. By the time they parted, a coffee date was set for the following day, a silent acknowledgement that something special had just begun. The next few months were a whirlwind of romance. Ethan and Clara were inseparable, their days filled with laughter, shared dreams, and the intoxicating thrill of discovering every facet of each other's personalities. He would surprise her with tickets to obscure plays she had mentioned in passing, and she would leave hand-drawn sketches on his desk, little windows into her artistic soul. Their love was a vibrant tapestry woven with the threads of stolen moments in crowded cafes, long walks in the park as autumn leaves painted the ground in hues of gold and crimson, and quiet evenings spent in comfortable silence, their presence alone enough to fill the space. It was during one of these idyllic evenings, curled up on his sofa with a classic film playing in the background, that Clara first mentioned her family. Her tone, usually so light and effervescent, carried a subtle weight that he hadn't heard before. She spoke of her parents, her older brother, and her two younger sisters with a mixture of love and a certain apprehension. They were, she explained, a very traditional family, deeply rooted in their cultural heritage and with a strong sense of community. Their approval, she admitted, was something she valued immensely, something she had always strived to earn. Ethan, ever the optimist, wasn't fazed. He was confident in his love for Clara, in the life they were building together. "They'll love you," he had said, his voice a reassuring balm on her unspoken anxieties. How could they not? He was a successful man, a vice president at a reputable financial firm, with a background that, while not as culturally rich as hers, was respectable and stable. He saw no reason why her family would object to their union. The day of the introduction came a few weeks later. It was a Sunday, the kind of crisp, clear autumn day that made the world feel full of promise. Ethan had spent the morning meticulously choosing his outfit, wanting to make the perfect first impression. He settled on a tailored navy suit, a classic choice that he hoped would convey both his professionalism and his respect for the occasion. He had even bought a bouquet of Clara's favorite flowers, white lilies, their delicate fragrance a symbol of the purity of his intentions. As they drove to her family's home in the suburbs, a sense of unease began to creep into the edges of his confidence. Clara was unusually quiet, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. He reached over and squeezed her hand, offering a smile that he hoped was more reassuring than he felt. "Hey," he said softly, "it's going to be fine, I promise." She managed a weak smile in return, but the anxiety in her eyes remained. The house was a stately two-story brick building, with a perfectly manicured lawn and a welcoming front porch. But as they stepped out of the car, the warmth of the autumn sun seemed to be replaced by a sudden chill. The front door opened before they even had a chance to ring the bell, and a man who could only be Clara's father stood in the doorway. He was a tall, imposing figure, with a stern expression etched onto his face. His eyes, the same deep brown as Clara's, held none of her warmth. They were cold, appraising, and as they swept over Ethan, from his polished shoes to his carefully styled hair, he felt a shiver run down his spine. The introductions were formal, almost clinical. Clara's father, Mr. DeMarco, shook his hand with a grip that was just a little too firm, his voice a low, gravelly monotone as he welcomed them inside. The interior of the house was as immaculate as the exterior, every piece of furniture in its perfect place, every surface gleaming. It felt less like a home and more like a museum, a carefully curated display of a life that was both foreign and intimidating to him. Clara's mother, a petite woman with her daughter's auburn hair now streaked with silver, offered a polite but distant smile. Her brother, a younger, more muscular version of his father, gave him a curt nod, his arms crossed over his chest in a gesture that was anything but welcoming. And her two younger sisters, who he had hoped might be a source of warmth and youthful energy, simply stared at him with wide, curious eyes, as if he were some strange creature on display. The dinner that followed was a stilted, uncomfortable affair. The conversation was dominated by Mr. DeMarco, who seemed to take a perverse pleasure in interrogating Ethan about his background, his career, and his intentions towards his daughter. Every question felt like a test, every answer scrutinized for any sign of weakness or unworthiness. Ethan did his best to remain poised and articulate, to present himself as the successful, responsible man he was. But with every passing minute, he could feel the walls closing in, the air in the room growing thick with unspoken disapproval. He tried to engage Clara's brother in a conversation about sports, a topic he had hoped would be a safe, common ground. But his attempts were met with monosyllabic answers and a dismissive shrug. He complimented Mrs. DeMarco on the delicious meal, a traditional dish that he had never tasted before, but his praise was met with a tight-lipped smile that didn't reach her eyes. The younger sisters whispered to each other in a language he didn't understand, their occasional giggles feeling like shards of ice against his skin. Throughout it all, Clara sat beside him, a silent, almost invisible presence. She would occasionally try to steer the conversation towards lighter topics, to bridge the growing chasm between him and her family, but her efforts were quickly shut down by her father's domineering presence. Ethan could see the distress in her eyes, the way she nervously pleated her napkin in her lap, and his heart ached for her. This was supposed to be a happy occasion, a celebration of their love, but it had turned into a trial, and he was the one on the stand. As the evening drew to a close, a sense of dread settled in the pit of his stomach. He knew, with a certainty that chilled him to the bone, that he had failed. He had not won them over. He had not earned their approval. He was an outsider, a threat to their carefully constructed world, and they had made it abundantly clear that he was not welcome. The drive back to the city was filled with a heavy silence. Clara stared out of the window, the city lights a blur of color against the darkness of her mood. Ethan wanted to reach out to her, to comfort her, but he didn't know what to say. The words of reassurance that had come so easily to him before now felt hollow and meaningless. When they finally reached her apartment, she turned to him, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. "I'm so sorry, Ethan," she whispered, her voice choked with emotion. "I never should have put you through that." He pulled her into his arms, holding her close, his own heart heavy with a mixture of anger and disappointment. "It's not your fault, Clara," he said, his voice a low, soothing murmur against her hair. They don't know me. They don't know us." But as he held her, a seed of doubt began to sprout in his mind. What if they never did? What if their love, which had felt so strong and unbreakable, was not enough to overcome the wall of prejudice and tradition that her family had erected around them? The thought was a cold, sharp pain in his chest, a premonition of the darkness that was yet to come. In the weeks that followed, the chasm between Ethan and Clara's family only widened. His attempts to bridge the gap were met with a cold, unyielding resistance. He sent flowers to her mother, a bottle of expensive scotch to her father, but his gestures were met with a stony silence. He called to invite them out to dinner, to a neutral ground where they could get to know each other away from the stifling formality of their home. But his invitations were politely but firmly declined. The few times he did see them were at family gatherings that Clara insisted he attend, hoping that his continued presence would eventually wear down their resistance. But each visit was a repeat of the first, a fresh wave of hostility and disapproval that left him feeling drained and demoralized. Mr. DeMarco would make thinly veiled comments about his different background, about the instability of his profession. Her brother would go out of his way to exclude him from conversations, turning his back on him whenever he tried to join in. And her mother and sisters would treat him with a polite but icy indifference that was almost more cutting than open hostility. The constant rejection began to take its toll on Ethan. The confident, optimistic man he had once been was slowly being replaced by someone who was a stranger to himself, someone who was consumed by a gnawing sense of inadequacy and resentment. He started to second-guess himself, to wonder if there was something inherently wrong with him, something that made him unworthy of their acceptance. He became more withdrawn, more irritable, and the easy laughter that had once been such a defining part of his personality was now a rare and fleeting sound. His relationship with Clara also began to suffer under the strain. The carefree joy that had once defined their love was now overshadowed by the constant tension with her family. Their conversations would inevitably circle back to the same topic, the same frustrating, unresolvable conflict. Clara was torn between her love for him and her loyalty to her family, and the emotional turmoil was tearing her apart. She would defend him to them, only to be met with a barrage of criticism and ultimatums. And when she would try to explain their perspective to him, he would see it as a betrayal, a sign that she was choosing them over him. The arguments became more frequent, more intense. He would accuse her of not standing up for him enough, of not being willing to choose him over her family. She would accuse him of being selfish, of not understanding the cultural pressures she was under. The love that had once been their sanctuary was now a battlefield, and they were both casualties of a war they had not chosen to fight. One evening, after a particularly heated argument, Clara broke down in tears. "I don't know what to do anymore, Ethan," she sobbed, her body racked with a despair that mirrored his own. "I love you. I love you more than anything, but they're my family. I can't just cut them out of my life." He held her, his own anger and frustration momentarily forgotten in the face of her raw, unfiltered pain. He knew she was right. He knew he was asking the impossible of her. But the injustice of it all, the unfairness of being judged and condemned by people who didn't even know him, was a bitter pill to swallow. It was in that moment, as he held the woman he loved, a woman who was being torn apart by the very people who were supposed to love and support her, that something inside him began to shift. The hope that had sustained him for so long, the belief that love could conquer all, began to curdle into a dark, corrosive resentment. The rejection was no longer just a source of pain and disappointment. It was becoming a personal affront, a challenge to his very worth as a man. And as he looked at the tear-stained face of the woman he loved, a dangerous thought began to take root in the darkest corners of his mind. If they wouldn't accept him, if they were determined to stand in the way of his happiness, then maybe, just maybe, they didn't deserve to be a part of her life at all. The thought was a fleeting, terrifying whisper, but it was a whisper that would grow louder and more insistent in the days and weeks to come, a harbinger of the storm that was gathering on the horizon. The initial warmth of their love story, once a blazing hearth, was now reduced to embers, struggling to survive the relentless, chilling winds of her family's disapproval. Ethan, a man who had built his life on a foundation of logic and control, found himself in a situation that defied both. He had presented his case, laid out his credentials, his love for Clara, his successful career, his unwavering commitment, but the jury of her family had already reached a verdict. Guilty of not being one of them. He started spending more time at work, seeking refuge in the familiar, predictable world of spreadsheets and market analyses. The numbers didn't judge him. The graphs didn't question his background. Here, he was in control, respected, a master of his domain. But the reprieve was always temporary. The moment he stepped out of the sterile, air-conditioned environment of his office, the reality of his personal life would come crashing back down on him. He became obsessed with understanding them, with trying to decipher the unwritten code of their cultural and familial expectations. He spent hours on the internet, reading articles about Clara's heritage, about their traditions, their values. He even tried to learn a few phrases in their native language, hoping that a small gesture of cultural appreciation might be the key to unlocking their acceptance. But his efforts were met with suspicion rather than appreciation. His attempts to connect were seen as a clumsy, insincere attempt to manipulate them, a further confirmation of his outsider status. The more he tried, the more he failed, and with each failure, the resentment grew, a toxic vine that was slowly wrapping itself around his heart. He started to see their rejection not as a personal preference, but as a deliberate, malicious act. They weren't just protecting their daughter. They were actively trying to destroy his happiness. They were the villains in his love story, the insurmountable obstacle that stood between him and the life he so desperately wanted. His friends, who had once been so happy for him, now looked at him with a mixture of concern and pity. They saw the change in him, the way the light had gone out of his eyes, the way his easy smile had been replaced by a permanent frown. They tried to offer advice, to be a sounding board for his frustrations. Maybe you should just give it some time, one would say. They'll come around eventually. Maybe she's not the one for you, another would suggest. If it's this hard. But he couldn't hear them. Their well-intentioned words were just background noise, drowned out by the deafening roar of his own anger and resentment. He was a man on a mission, and the mission was to win. He had never been one to back down from a challenge, and he wasn't about to start now. He saw this as a battle, a test of his will, and he was determined to emerge victorious. But the battlefield was not a boardroom, and the weapons were not logic and reason. They were emotions, traditions, and a bond of blood that he could never be a part of. And so, with every move he made, he was only digging himself deeper into a trench of his own making. The breaking point came on the day of Clara's younger sister's engagement party. He had not been invited, a deliberate public snub that was designed to send a clear and unequivocal message. He was not, and would never be, a part of their family. Clara had been devastated, her pleas and arguments with her parents falling on deaf ears. She had offered to skip the party in solidarity with him, but he had insisted she go. He didn't want her to sacrifice her relationship with her family for him, even though, in the darkest corners of his mind, that was exactly what he wanted. He wanted her to choose him, to prove that their love was stronger than their blood. He had spent that evening alone in his apartment, the silence a heavy, oppressive blanket. He had tried to distract himself with work, with a movie, with a book, but the image of Clara at that party, surrounded by her family, celebrating a union that had been blessed and approved, was a constant, tormenting presence in his mind. He saw them all, her father, her mother, her brother, her sisters, all smiling, all happy. Their joy a stark, cruel contrast to his own misery. And in that moment, his resentment morphed into something far more dangerous. It became a cold, hard, unadulterated hatred. He started to fantasize about a world where they didn't exist, a world where he and Clara could be together without the constant shadow of their disapproval. The fantasies were at first fleeting, abstract, a way to cope with his feelings of powerlessness. But as the days turned into weeks, they became more vivid, more detailed, more real. He would imagine them gone, a tragic accident, a sudden illness, anything that would remove them from the equation. He knew the thoughts were wrong, that they were a sign of a mind that was beginning to unravel, but he couldn't stop them. They were a source of comfort, a dark, twisted form of solace in a world that had become a source of constant pain. He started to withdraw from Clara, his anger and resentment now a barrier between them. He couldn't look at her without seeing them, without being reminded of their rejection. Their conversations became strained, their silences filled with unspoken accusations. She could feel him slipping away, and she didn't know how to bring him back. She suggested they go to counseling, that they talk to someone who could help them navigate this impossible situation. But he refused. He didn't need a therapist. He needed a solution, And the solution that was beginning to form in his mind was one that no therapist could ever condone. The idea, when it first came to him, was not a fully formed plan, but a single terrifying thought. What if he just made them disappear? The thought was so shocking, so out of character for the man he had always been, that he immediately dismissed it. It was the thought of a madman, a monster. But the seed had been planted, and in the fertile ground of his hatred and despair, it began to grow. He started to research, his late-night internet searches shifting from cultural traditions to something far more sinister. He read about poisons, about untraceable weapons, about ways to make a death look like an accident. He told himself it was just a morbid curiosity, a way to vent his frustration in a harmless virtual world. But with each article he read, with each piece of information he gathered, the line between fantasy and reality began to blur. He started to watch them, to study their routines, their habits. He would drive by their house at night, the warm glow from their windows a symbol of the life he had been denied. He would follow them to the grocery store, to the dry cleaners, to the church they attended every Sunday. He was a ghost in their lives, an invisible observer of the family that had so casually and cruelly rejected him. And with each observation, his plan began to take shape, the abstract fantasy solidifying into a concrete, terrifying reality. He knew it was a point of no return. He knew that if he went through with it, he would be crossing a line from which there was no coming back. He would be destroying not just their lives, but his own. But in his twisted, broken mind, it was the only way. It was the only way to get what he wanted. It was the only way to win. The love story that had begun with such bright, vibrant colors had now been painted over with the dark, chilling hues of obsession and revenge. The final brushstrokes were about to be laid, and the masterpiece he was about to create would be one of terror and of blood. The stage was set, the players in their places, and the final act was about to begin. And as he stood in the shadows, watching the unsuspecting family, a chilling thought crossed his mind. They had said no to him, and now he would give them his answer. And it would be an answer they would never forget. The night he chose was a Saturday, a night like any other, the kind of ordinary, unremarkable night that would forever be seared into the memory of the community as the night the darkness came to their quiet, tree-lined street. The DeMarco family was at home, their house a beacon of warmth and light in the cool autumn evening. They had just finished dinner, the lingering aroma of roasted chicken and herbs a ghost of the life that was about to be so brutally extinguished. Ethan had parked his car a few blocks away, the tools of his trade laid out on the passenger seat beside him. A roll of duct tape, a set of zip ties, a hunting knife he had bought a few weeks earlier, its blade sharpened to a razor's edge, and a gun, a cold, heavy piece of metal that he had acquired through a series of increasingly desperate and dangerous back-alley transactions. He was a man transformed, the successful, sophisticated executive he had once been now just a hollow shell, a disguise for the monster that had taken his place. He approached the house from the back, moving through the shadows with a stealth and a purpose that would have surprised even himself. The back door, as he had known it would be from his weeks of surveillance, was unlocked. A small, careless oversight that would have devastating consequences. He slipped inside, his heart pounding in his chest, a frantic, rhythmic drumbeat that was the only sound in the sudden, deafening silence of the house. He found them in the living room, their faces illuminated by the flickering blue light of the television. Mr. DeMarco was in his favorite armchair, a newspaper resting on his lap. Mrs. DeMarco was on the sofa, a half-finished cup of tea on the end table beside her. And the two younger sisters were on the floor, their laughter echoing through the room as they played a board game. Clara's brother was not there, a small, unexpected mercy in the midst of the carnage that was about to unfold. The first to see him was the youngest sister. Her laughter died in her throat, her eyes widening in a mixture of confusion and fear. Her sister followed her gaze, and then her mother, and then her father. The scene was frozen for a moment, a tableau of dawning horror. And then the screaming started. He was a force of nature, a whirlwind of rage and violence that they were powerless to stop. He was stronger than he had ever been, his body fueled by a potent cocktail of adrenaline and a hatred that had been simmering for months. He subdued them one by one, his movements quick, efficient, a chilling testament to the hours he had spent rehearsing this moment in his mind. He bound them with the zip ties, their struggles futile against his superior strength. He gagged them with the duct tape, their muffled screams a symphony of terror that only fueled his rage. And then, when they were all helpless before him, he began to speak. His voice was a low, menacing growl, a sound that was barely human. He told them who he was, though they already knew. He told them what they had done to him, how they had taken the one thing that had ever made him happy and tried to destroy it. He told them that he had loved Clara, that he would have done anything for her, but they had stood in his way, and now they would pay the price. He started with the father, the man who had been the architect of his pain, the man whose cold, dismissive eyes had been the source of his humiliation. He looked into those eyes one last time, and for a fleeting moment, he saw not arrogance, but a raw, primal fear, and it was a sight that brought him a dark, twisted satisfaction. The knife was a cold, sharp extension of his will. The first plunge was a shock, a jolt of an almost electrical intensity that coursed through his body. The second was easier, and by the third, it was as if he were in a trance, a mindless, repetitive motion that was divorced from the reality of what he was doing. The mother was next, her muffled sobs a desperate, unheard plea for mercy. And then the sisters, their young lives cut short before they had even had a chance to begin. He was a butcher in a slaughterhouse, his hands and his clothes stained with the evidence of his monstrous acts. When it was over, he stood in the center of the room, the silence now a heavy, suffocating blanket. The only sound was his own ragged breathing, the frantic, desperate gasps of a man who had just crossed a line from which there was no return. He looked at the carnage he had created, at the lifeless bodies that were a testament to his rage, and for the first time, a flicker of something other than hatred entered his mind. It was a flicker of, what? Regret? Remorse? He didn't know. He was too far gone to be able to decipher the complex, contradictory emotions that were now at war within him. He knew he had to leave. He knew that every second he remained in that house was a second closer to being caught. He turned to go, but as he did, his eyes fell on a framed photograph on the mantelpiece. It was a picture of Clara, her face a beacon of light and life in the midst of the darkness and death that now surrounded him. He picked it up, his blood-stained fingers leaving a grotesque, crimson smear on the glass. He looked at her smiling face, and in that moment, the full weight of what he had done came crashing down on him. He had not just killed her family. He had killed her. He had destroyed the one person he had ever loved, the one person he had done all of this for. The realization was a physical blow, a punch to the gut that left him gasping for air. He had won the battle, but in doing so, he had lost the war. He was still standing there, staring at the photograph, when the first sirens began to wail in the distance. The sound was at first faint, a distant, almost dreamlike cry. But it grew louder and louder, a relentless, approaching crescendo that was a harbinger of the end of his world. The police found him sitting on the floor, the photograph of Clara clutched in his hand, his body and his soul stained with the blood of the innocent. He did not resist. He did not speak. He was a broken man, a hollowed-out shell of the person he had once been. The love story that had begun with a chance encounter on a busy city street had ended in a bloodbath in a quiet suburban home. And as they led him away in handcuffs, the flashing red and blue lights of the police cars painting a grotesque, macabre light on the house of horrors he had created, he knew that he would spend the rest of his life haunted by the ghost of the woman he had loved, and the ghosts of the family he had so brutally, so senselessly destroyed. The final chapter had been written, and it was a chapter that would be remembered not for its love, but for its hate, not for its passion, but for its pain. It was a story of a love forbidden, a descent into madness, and a reckoning that had left a trail of shattered lives and broken hearts in its wake. And it was a story that would serve as a chilling reminder of the darkness that can lurk beneath the surface of even the most ordinary of lives, and the devastating consequences of a love that is not allowed to bloom.